Okay, good evening. We're going to start. Welcome to the Maison Française at Columbia. Thank you for coming on another evening of closures of the campus and difficulties to arrive at la Maison Française. So thank you for your effort. I am and we are collectively delighted to welcome Cécile Vidal to the Maison Française. Cécile Vidal is an historian of the Atlantic world. She's been working on in a very large geographical span on the Atlantic world from the 17th to the 19th century. She wrote in 2003 with Gilles Havard a book that was very important to me, a synthesis called The Histoire de l'Amérique Française, and that was republished, reedited in 2019, right? She also co-edited in 2021 New Orleans, Louisiana, and Saint Louis, Senegal, Mirror Cities in the Atlantic World, 1659 to the 2000s. So you see the very large geographical span. She also edited Une histoire sociale du Nouveau Monde at the Édition de la HESS in 2021. I forgot to say that she is a professor at the Ecole des Hautes Etudes en Sciences Sociales, as we say in French, a directrice d'études. And she, a few years before that, she wrote a book called Caribbean New Orleans, Empire, Race, and the Making of a Slave Society, published at the University of North Carolina Press. And some of my students, if they have not read it yet, will read it by Tuesday. So if you have questions, if you've already done your readings, you can ask the questions to the author. And she also co-edited this book called Les Mondes de l'Esclavage with Benedetta Rossi and Paulin Ismar. Paulin Ismar is a historian of Greece, and so Les Mondes de l'Esclavage is going to be the basis for a presentation today. But it is a very, she won't say that because she's humble, but it's a very, very important intervention in the historiography of slavery in French, trying to think about the connections and disconnects between different ways in which the institution of slavery was enacted in different places at different times. And I think there is the idea in the US often that French people are not interested in slavery, that they have silenced it, neglected it. It was true for a long time, but with people like Cécile Vidal, this is no longer the case. So we thank her for doing that, and we thank her for being here tonight and for presenting that great book. I can leave it here if you want to Post-its are mine, and if you want to use it for your talk.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Emmanuel. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Jean-Pierre and the Columbia Maison Française. I'm delighted to be here to present Les Mondes de l'Esclavage, une histoire comparée. As Emmanuel said, we were 3 historians and editing this book, and it's important. I'm going to talk a little bit about them. The first one, the major editor, was Paulin Ismar, who's an historian of ancient Greece. Then Benedetta Rossi, who's an historian and anthropologist of modern Africa, and myself, who works on the colonial Americas. It was important that the main editor was an historian of ancient Greece, and that they were also an African historian. And at the beginning of the project, there was a 4th editor, Claude Chevaler, who's an historian of China. So we were responsible, each of us was responsible for one continent. And it was important that the book was not directed by a specialist of the Americas, because the slave studies have been centered very much for a very long time based on the American historiography. And so we needed to decenter this historiography from this Americanocentrism. So apart from the 3 editors, we gathered a very international team with 68 contributors based in France, the rest of Europe, England, Germany, Italy, Portugal, North America, Mexico, Brazil, Africa, South Africa, and Kenya, and China. It means that the book is much more international than similar books published in the Anglophone world, in which most of the contributors are Anglophone speakers. In our case, it was the contrary, because 1/3 of the articles were originally written not in French, but in a foreign language, so mostly English, but also German, Spanish, and Portuguese, which means that the book is not a presentation of only of the French and Francophone historiography on slavery. It's a kind of encounter, crossroads of several historiographies. We don't share all point of view. We argued a lot while we were writing and editing the book, and it's very important. And so most of them were historians, but there were also a few anthropologists, archaeologists, sociologists, and a professor of law. And also a writer, a novelist, Leonora Miano, who wrote the epilogue of the volume. So the book is composed of 93 articles, so you don't read the book from the first page to the last page, which is 1,152 pages, so you can't read the stand, so you can travel through the book according to your own interest. It took us 5 years of work, so it's not so long, in fact, to produce such a book. And we intended the book as much as a scientific contribution, as a book accessible to a general audience. So the book was published in 2021 for the 21st anniversary of the Taubira law, which is the first law in front of a national parliament, which recognized the trade of enslaved people and slavery as a crime against humanity. The law was passed in reaction of a social movement launched on May 23rd, 1998 in Paris, at the time of the 150th anniversary of the second abolition of slavery in the French Empire. And people, especially people from overseas territories, were complaining of the kind of celebration focused on the metropole and on the white abolitionists, Schulcher, and so on. And they wanted to be better represented. And they plea for not only the recognition of slavery as a crime against humanity, but the convergence between national and colonial history and the integration of the history of slavery within the main national narrative. And so the law was passed a few years later under the patronage of Christine Taubira. And it's very important because the book, so after the law was passed, a center on the memory of the slave trade and slavery was founded, and it gave us, historians of slavery, a kind of visibility and legitimacy we didn't have before. And there was a rise of studies on the slave trade and slavery in France, and the volume is the result of this 20 years of research on slavery in France and elsewhere. So what we wanted to do was two things. First, we wanted to write a global world, but also comparative, and the comparison is very important in our approach. So a global and comparative history of slavery, asking what is slavery, how is it different from other forms of domination and exploitation, how is it different from serfdom, from indenture, from other kinds of servitude, for instance. How did slave systems operate? What were the commonalities and differences between the various forms of slavery through space and time? So that was the main question. But we also wanted to write a kind of history of the world through the prism of slavery, through the perspective of slavery, to answer the question how slavery shaped and informed societies throughout the world. So the book shows first the ubiquity of slavery, the fact that slavery existed in one form or another form in most societies over human history. There are some societies without slavery, but not so many, in fact. But at the same time, we emphasize the diversity of the forms of slavery, of the slave system, according to space and time. But this emphasis on the existence of slavery all over the world and through time, we worried that it was going to minimize the specificity of the Atlantic system of slavery. And in fact, we've fought very much not to do that. And we think that at the end, the comparison helps to show how specific the Atlantic system of slavery developed by Europeans in the Atlantic world was an exceptional slave system for many reasons we can talk about. So, to adopt a comparative approach, you need to recognize various phenomena taking different aspects as slavery through space and time. So you need a minimal definition or one or several minimal definitions of slavery to start working and test these definitions. But what we didn't want to do was, as it has been done for a very long time, is to take the system taking place in North America during the antebellum as a model used to compare all the kind of slavery, and when they don't fit the model, they are not considered as genuine slavery, so we thought that it was problematic. And we didn't want to use a unique historical and static definitions of slavery, in the sense we didn't want to go against the historicization and contextualization of slavery. And so the solution we found was to take several characteristics, and not one, and analyze what characteristic among a variety characteristic forging the slave conditions are more pertinent to describe and understand one's slaveholding society over the other, and it depends. So the three characteristics, I'm going to talk about them. It's property, social death, and bond labor. The first definition of slavery based on property is the most common one. It's the one inherited from Roman law, the one which was prevalent in the colonial Americas, and the one which is used nowadays in international law, starting with the Slavery Convention signed in Geneva in 1926, when they started to fight against slavery on an international level. And so the Article 1 of the Convention defines slavery as the status or condition of a person over whom any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership are exercised. This definition has been criticized for several reasons. The first reason, it was by Orlando Patterson, which argues that the importance of property is not the fact that people are treated as objects, but the importance is the fact that they can't own anything. So that's one criticism. The other main criticism is the fact that not all societies, so it's a definition based on a Western notion of property, and not all societies through the world have the same notion of property. But Benedetta Rossi has an objection to that. The importance is not in the property. Property is a kind of metaphor for the powers attached to property. The fact that, and she defines slavery as the status or condition of a person over whom the most totalizing and all-encompassing powers imaginable in a society are exercised. So slavery is always the worst status possible in a society. And it's why people who are victims of slavery are able to recognize it, in fact. The second definition is the definition proposed by the US sociologist born in Jamaica, Orlando Patterson, but also the French anthropologist Alain Testard. And so it's a more elaborate definition, but what I want to emphasize is the idea of the exclusion of the civic community and of kinship relationships, which led to a lack of protection. And so what do we mean by that for the inclusion from kinship relationships? So enslaved people form families, but at any moment they could be sold, they could be killed without any consideration of their family integration. So social death was always a virtual possibility, planning and threatening their lives. The third definition is the definition associated with labor, bond labor. And in American historiography, very often slavery is reduced to a kind of bond labor. But in my opinion, it's in fact the least convincing definition. Of course, slavery is a kind of forced labor or bond labor, but you can't reduce slavery to bond labor, because if you do that, you miss the specificity of slavery. And it's so in fact, the slave condition is better defined by the indeterminacy in the way you can use enslaved men and women. And you can use them for both productive and reproductive capacities, and not only to work. So, starting with this definition of slavery, we wanted also to pay attention to the variety of slave-holding societies. And there were two distinctions we wanted to make in the book. The first distinction is between some slave societies in which slavery and freedom are constructed in opposition to the other. So slavery and versus freedom, it's slavery, and they were conceived together as two opposites. And it's the way it was in ancient Greece, in the Roman Empire, in the colonial Americas. But in most slave societies throughout the world, in fact, there was no idea of freedom. Most people were not considered free. They were in a kind of dependency. And slavery was only one form of dependencies among several. But we insist that it was a singular form of dependency, and even if slavery must be analyzed in continuity with these other forms of dependency, people recognize it as the most terrible form of dependency possible. So that's one distinction we wanted to make. And the other distinction is the distinction between societies with slaves versus slave societies. So this analytical distinction was first conceived by Moses Finlay, the historian of ancient Greece, in the 1960s, even though the notion of slave society was also mobilized by an historian of the Caribbean, Elsa Gouveia, at the same time. But she was not opposing slave society and society with slaves, but it's in a book. And so for Finlay, the definition of a slave society was based on two parameters, one demographic, one economic. The first one was the fact that there were more than 20% of enslaved people, and it was a complete arbitrary figure. In fact, there's no explanation for this number of 20%. And the second parameter was the central role played by enslaved people in the productive system. Based on these two criteria, he thought that there were only 5 societies in the world fitting his definition, ancient Rome and Greece, the Caribbean, Brazil, and antebellum North America. So we have a complete Western paradigm of a true slave society. After the rise of global studies of slavery, now that we know much more about slavery all over the world, historians have come up with new definitions of a slave society, and Paulin Ismar is one among the historians. And in the book, we use two of them, in fact, in tension. One is the fact that in a slave society, slavery played a central role in the social reproduction of the society. I will give the example of the Ottoman Empire. In the Ottoman Empire, there were only something like 5% of slaves, enslaved people. They were not central at all in the productive system, but they played such a role in the administration and in the military that the empire itself could not work without enslaved people. The second definition, which fit better the Americas, are the fact that in a slave society, the whole society had to mobilize to ensure the social reproduction of slavery. So the issue here is not the reproduction of society, but the reproduction of the slave system itself, which inform all relationships and institutions. There's a cookie. And based on these two definitions, now we can identify many more slave society through the world. So, for instance, the Ottoman Empire, the Sokoto Caliphate, medieval Korea can be considered as a slave society. So, with this definition and proposition to look at the various forms of slavery and slave societies, we organized the book in 3 parts. The first part is entitled Situation and is composed of 50 articles from prehistoric time to present-day modern slavery. And the goal was to decenter the gaze, so to go away from what people know the best, you know, and slavery in the Roman Empire, slavery in the Americas, and to show the situation they are not familiar with, and to vary also the geographical and chronological scales of analysis. And so I have translated a few titles to give you example of articles you can find in the first part. So the first one about the existence of slavery in ancient India. So that's an article dealing with a huge territory through several centuries. But you have also an article, the one written by Anita Ruprecht, The Journey of the Blind, which is an article about a single voyage of a slave ship through the Atlantic between Le Havre, Western Africa, and Guadeloupe, in which all the enslaved on board and the crew got the disease called ophthalmia and became blind because of it, and the story became an abolitionist affair and was used to push for abolition. So it gives you an example, and a last example is the article written by the anthropologist David Jabin, who works on slavery among the Yuki people of Bolivian Amazonia, who still practice slavery in the second half of the 20th century. And so that's a series of maps showing all the articles. They are in French for those who can read the French. So it's in the Americas, Africa, Asia. So the second part of the book is called Comparison. This part, which is the center of the book, it's the reason why we said that there are 2 books in one. Because the first part, for the first part and for the third part, I will talk later about, we ask external contributors even if we wrote some of the articles. But this part, Paulin, Benedetta, and I, that's the part we wrote nearly entirely, except a few articles written by Claude Chevaler and Mehmed Waldi. And it's the most original one, and I put the cover of two books of the same kind of the Cambridge World of Slavery, published between 2011 and 2021, and the Palgrave Handbook of Global Slavery, published last year. And they have also the global perspective, but they just juxtapose case studies, chapters about various regions and periods in time. While in this section, we really try to adopt a comparative approach and to, within thematic articles, to talk about, to compare various slave society. So the comparison, it's not so much between slave societies, that through one institution or phenomenon, offering an interesting perspective on slavery. So we picked 26 of them. You can see the list. It's in alphabetic order in French, so it's completely different in English. And so this series of manumission to slave voices, so it allows us to see the plural definitions of slavery, the various modes of enslavement and social reproduction of slavery, the porous frontier between slavery and other forms of domination and exploitation, some particular forms of slavery like public slavery or contractual slavery, the slave relationships, and how slavery impacted slave society. So for us, comparatism was a kind of laboratory. The benefits of the method is to allow to the comparative approach, the heuristic value of comparison is the fact that it's explicative in itself, because you compare two contexts and you find in the two contexts you are comparing the reason for the commonalities or differences between two or several situations. The other thing is that it helps you decompartmentalize historiographies by transferring questions and approaches, debates from one historiography to another or several ones, to test one explanation proposed by one historiography and in another situation, and to inspire scientific imagination. The problem, of course, is to do that at the scale of the world, on the longue durée of the l'histoire de l'humanité, and I can say at the beginning I was very skeptical that it was possible, but we did it, and so we try. And the other problem is that necessarily we base, the article are based on secondary literature and not on primary sources. You can't work on primary sources at that scale. And the articles are short, and so it means that you don't have the room to detail the context of each situation you are talking about. So for us, these articles were a kind of laboratory. We did not want to produce something definitive. We were, in fact, very humble in what we were trying to do. It was not, proposing definitive and close interpretation. It was proposal to be discussed, tested, validated, or rejected by others. And I'm convinced that it was worth it, even if you are not in the position when you want to appear as a very fine scholar and everything. But it was a kind of risky approach, but it was worth doing it in my point of view. The last part is called transformation, and it's a part with something like 15 articles. You have all the titles translated into English. And in this section, we are trying to analyze the major influx, changes, transformation of slavery in world history. So we are showing how the world history was changed by major turns in the history of slavery. And what we try to do is to also decenter things by, for instance, I will give the example of the article on abolitionism and abolition, who has been written by Benedetta Rossi. Usually these kind of articles are written by specialists of the Americas because it all starts in the Atlantic world. But the same article written by an historian of modern Africa is completely different, gives another view on the subject and the fact that, you know, the abolition of slavery within the European empires between the early 19th up to the end of the 19th century is just the beginning of the story and certainly not the end. So it was, so Benedetta is showing this kind of contribution. And so, I'm forgotten. So, in addition to the third session, we had the honor to have the conclusion written by Orlando Patterson, who's this major sociologist who wrote this incredible book, A Comparative and World History of Slavery in 1982, and then the epilogue by the French-African novelist Leonora Miano. So for me, it was a kind of transformative experience. As a historian of the Americas, you are used to compare slaveries throughout the Americas and in the European empires, and to read extensively. And the historiography on slavery in the Americas is already huge, so it's difficult to follow everything published on the subject. But for many reasons, I've started after writing this book and editing this book to see American slavery differently, and I will give some example of it. And I will give, the first example was the relationship between slavery and race, which is so crucial in American slavery. And so I think differently about this connection because I've realized how, in fact, all slave systems are based on a kind of marginalization, alterization of enslaved people. They are constructed always as others, and it's a necessary condition to exploit them the way they are. And but throughout the world, this alterization, this construction of enslaved people as other, is based either on religion, ethnicity, the opposition between barbarity and civilized people, or race. And there's a huge debate between, you know, the relationship between slavery and race. It is something you find only in the American slavery, or before in the Roman Empire, or before in Muslim societies, and after, and so on. Personally, I'm convinced that everything is starting in the Atlantic world. But it means that even when you are studying American slavery, you are viewing differently the relationship between the two, because you know that there are forms of slavery as hard as American slavery, but which are not based on race. Which means that you have to ask what is related to slavery itself and what is connected to race, and what race do to slavery, in fact. And so you see the relationship and the development of racial slavery in different ways for this reason. Another example is the relationship between slavery and gender. Even if there's a growing historiography on the subject, when you work on a global history of slavery, the issue of gender and women is obvious because in the world history, most of enslaved people were women and girls. And unfortunately, we have chosen a man for the cover. And in fact, with Benedetta, we tried to convince our editor to pick a woman because it would have been more representative of slavery throughout the history and even modern slavery. But they wanted this cover, and so we can talk about this cover. But so it's a very important issue, and maybe in the book. So in the book we explore that, but I'm editing a special issue of the review of the journal Clio, Femmes, Genre, Histoire, which continue to explore how you view slavery differently when you integrate the issue of gender. And finally, the last example I will give is the fact that when you're an American, a specialist of the Americas, you work on slavery as the past. Even if the legacy of slavery is very powerful and has a present-day meaning, still it's something in the past. And most of people are convinced of the evil of slavery, and so we have a kind of abolitionist historiography. It's an assumption, it's a premise that slavery is a crime against humanity. But when you are an historian or anthropologist of Africa as Benedetta, you work on societies where slavery is a present issue, a present-day issue, and you work on societies in which they are still not convinced that it's a crime against humanity. And with people defending the legitimacy of enslaving other people. And so you see how it's different to work with these premises, and the fact that we need, in fact, to try to think even on American slavery as to understand the way it worked, it operated at the time as a normal institution, normal in the sense that it was justified by law and implemented by law, and that it was questioned only very late in time, starting with the abolitionist revolution in the second half of the 18th century. And so it changed the way you see American slavery if you take better into account the African part of the story, in fact. So that's it. And so the book was just translated and published into German. And we hope that someday it will be published also in English. We'll see. So thank you for your attention.
So we have time for questions. Knowing the work that people do here, I'm sure there are tons of questions. And so I have the first question, and the mic will circulate, so just...
Thank you so much for a really interesting talk. I really enjoyed it, very informative. I had a question about the epilogue. I would like to know how you came to choose a novelist, Leonora Miano, and whether you think she brought a specific perspective to the table as a novelist.
She's a novelist who has written on the slave trade in Western Africa. I can't remember right now the name of the novel, but it's in fact a beautiful novel. And she was writing about the future of Africa and the impact of the memory of slavery in Africa and what's going on nowadays in Africa. And yes, and she doesn't write as an historian or social scientist. She has not the same position. She can say things we can't say and we don't want to say because we want to stay in our role of historians and social scientists. So it was interesting, yes.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you about the reception of the book in France when it came out. You mentioned that, I mean, it's very obviously an academic book, but you mentioned that it also had a public outlook, or at least a dimension of it was trying to reach new readers. And so I wanted to, yes, invite you to speak a bit about how it was received in general outside of academia as well as inside, whatever seems more appropriate or relevant to you.
So in 6 months, we sold 16,000 copies of the book. So, but you know, it's in France, we buy more historical, the general audience is more open to buying this kind of things, books. So it was an editorial success, and I don't know, the first year with Paulin, we did something like 40, 50 presentations of the book everywhere, in festivals, movie theaters, in all kind of places. And so we were very, it was interesting to do that, and we were very moved, in fact, in two situations. The first situation is when we presented the book at l'Institut du Tout Monde d'Edouard Glissant. And the man who talked about the book was saying that it was a kind of revenge against Olivier Pétré-Grenouilleau's book, because they felt very much offended, in fact, by the book, and Glissant was very disappointed at the time. And so for us, it was a kind of revenge and you know, giving the true place to the history of slavery in relation to national history. And so for us, it was very important in the sense that it was a confirmation that writing on slavery with a global perspective was not going against the acknowledgement of the importance of the history of slavery within the French Empire, and so that was very moving. And the other very moving experience we had with this book was a man in his 70s who sent us a letter, and the letter was saying something like, he was, he has spent his life reading history books, and he picked this one, but he never felt related to the issue of slavery because he thought that slavery was the history of others. But he was a true Republican, a humanist, and so on. And then he told us, he wrote to us that he suddenly he realized that, in fact, it was also about him. You know, he was a descendant of a peasant family, and so he was imagining his ancestor, in serfdom, but not in slavery, and so on. But then suddenly, for him, because of the book, it was a history of the humanity, and he was as much concerned by this history as any other human being, in fact. So my God, so if you can change, a 70-something old man, what do you ask? But, and finally, I would say that there was not much criticism, political criticism, either on the left or on the extreme left or on the extreme right, and we were not so much, except for one article or two. We were spared, in fact, at the moment it's so hard to have a discussion about slavery, colonization, even gender, and as historians we are described as Islamo-gauchist and so on. But with this book, because it was a world history of slavery, and because we did not refuse to compare any kind of slave systems, it was then possible to talk about the specificity of the Atlantic system of slavery. And so, so go ahead.
Thank you very much. you mentioned that it was very important for you in this project that a third of the articles were written by people not francophone. And you mentioned that it was a way to avoid perspective that would be just the French historiography. Could you tell us more about how you, after this project, how you see this French historiography compared to, let's say, the American one, or if you, because you mentioned it, so do you think that there is now still, or again, or whatever, French historiography compared to other historiographies?
So first, there are much work to do on the French Empire and slavery and the French Empire. And then there are several historiographies on the French Empire. There are the historiography written from the Hexagone, from the ancient metropole. There are the historiography written from the Antilles. And then you have the US historiography on the French Empire. And of course, we talk with one another, but at the same time, we are not doing exactly the same thing, and we have different style of writing history, so yes, but what I'm trying to, but at the same time, there's. I have much hope in my PhD students. In fact, there's a new generation doing incredible work on slavery and the French Empire and navigating between various historiography, being very international researchers. And trying, even me, I have, in all my life, I have moved between the US and France. And I'm trying to write books which are both acceptable in France and in the US. It's a kind of tricky things, but you learn to do it. And to take the what is best in both systems, in fact. And so it's what I'm trying to do. And what I'm telling my students is that you can do things differently, but at the same time, so the Anglophone historiography, the US historiography on slavery, but also the British one, and it's huge. They have done many things, and you can take inspiration from what they have done. But at the same time, you need to take into account what they have done and not do exactly the same thing. To ask questions differently, or and now that we have this Atlantic perspective or world perspective, and you need to dwell on the other historiographies, and it's even if they are not the same kind of books published on such and such aspect of slavery, you don't need to fill the gaps. You need to ask innovative questions, allowing you to see slavery differently.
Has the book been reviewed in any Marxist press?
I would say it was, we had an interesting adventure with Lundi Matin. I don't know if you're familiar with Lundi Matin. And we had, in fact, a series of 4 reviews of the book. I can't even remember the name of the man who wrote this series of 4 reviews and the first one was a good one. The second one was more critical, and then, unfortunately, the reviewer was very critical of David Jabin's article about the Yuki and Amazonia, because there's a kind of anthropology going against Pierre Clastres and La Société sans État, and so he was ferocious, and with him, and so we had to intervene, and so it was ugly, and so it was not very interesting because of that. And so we had to respond, and so he wanted to respond. So so you can look at them, but it was not. And at the end, the main reproach was the fact that we didn't use his book. So
So I found this it is on really impressive and really inspiring. I'm especially interested in the second section, which, if I understand correctly, you and your editors wrote most of those articles, most of those comparative pieces. And I wonder if you just talk a little bit about the challenge of doing those kinds of distillations when the secondary literature is so uneven. Because there are some parts of the world where there's a lot has been written about manumission, for example, and other parts where I would imagine the secondary literature would be quite thin, if non-existent. So I'm interested in those kinds of imbalances when you're trying to do a kind of a world survey, but the material that you have to draw upon is at different stages of scholarly development.
So we don't pretend to be exhaustive in any way. So it's not possible, and it's not something we wish, because it's impossible, and there's no point of being exhaustive. But we wanted to read extensively, but we were limited by the historiographies, and by our language skills. And I don't read German, I don't read Chinese, I don't read so many languages, and in fact I read very few languages. And so that was a challenge, which means that we are dependent on what is translated into English, more or less. I know other things, but then you are so. When we did so, the way we worked is that when each of us were responsible for a series of articles, but we started to discuss them and exchanging bibliographies. You know, Paulin giving me books to read. The first article I wrote was the one on death. And so he gave me some titles, Benedetta other titles. And so we exchanged bibliography, ideas about what to read, not to read, and everything. And then it was, part of the book was written during the pandemic. And so we were at home, confined, and so. But so the historiography. So the book was possible because the historiography, the global history of slavery has, you know, there's a rise in works all over the world, and there's so much material now, and so I spend days and months, weeks and months reading, and at some time you just, and then I wrote this first article, and at the beginning I was very skeptical what I could do, but then when you put together some pieces you have taken from everything you're reading, and even if you don't cover everything, and you are taking into account only a few societies through human history, you can see things you would not see otherwise. And for instance, I will give the example of the fact that when I was writing this article about death, the fact of writing about les morts d'accompagnement, I don't know how to say that in English, so in many societies, and Testar worked a lot about that. Some people are buried with their master, husband, or it's always dependents, and among these dependents, very often some enslaved people. And so it was very interesting to compare this practice with the practice of manumitting slaves at the death of the master, and the two practices are telling the same thing, that you are so tied to one person that you can't be the slave of anyone else, and so either you die with him or you are free after his death. So it says something. So it's this kind of rapprochement, putting together things, and then you realize something and you understand something you are not, that's new in practice. So.
Which one is the one that you as the writer felt the more connected to, or that you, is there one that specifically that you like, or I mean not like, but that you feel like
That for me, so right now I'm working on a new book project on suicide in the slave trade and slavery. So the article on death was very important because of that. But I also, I learned, many things in the process. And for instance, I wrote the articles about revolts. And I've been reading about revolts in the America. That's a very important subject. But reading about the enslaved revolts in China in the 17th century or in the Roman Empire, and so you understand things differently because of you're connecting. But at the same time, there are some articles which were very difficult to write. For instance, the one which was the most difficult to write was the one on culture, because the historiography on the America is so controversial. There's so much debate about that, and we don't have much material to write about it for other parts of the world. But at the same time, I didn't want to work only on to write only on the American, so that was very difficult. So the first one, I first write 80 pages, something like that, and then I...
Thank you so much. It was really interesting. I was wondering, you referred to the doxa that in the US the slavery belongs to a distant past. But for example, in this room, I imagine that there are many objects that were fabricated by slaves, as we go in China, etc. Isn't it just another new system of slavery, as you call it? And if so, do we have the way to determine it? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. Of course, the book addresses the issue of what we call modern or contemporary slavery. But at the same time, I realize, it's possible to write about the slave system very easily in the past, but something changed when it's forbidden everywhere. So nowadays it's forbidden in every country all over the world. There's not one place where it's legally possible. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, and in fact it exists nearly in every country. There are an estimation of 50 million of enslaved people in 2021, so it's huge. It's one person over 150, so it's, yes. And so it's reality. There are enslaved people in the US and in every country. But what I was referring to is the fact that people working on American slavery, they don't work very much in connection with people working on modern slavery. So that's two different historiographies, and they don't talk to each other. So when you work on American slavery, you work on something in the past, but you don't think that it's something in present. But it's changing. In a research center on slavery, they are trying to connect past and modern slavery. It's true in Yale, it's true in Hull, it's true in many places now, but still it's different. And I would add only one thing. And in the US, the debate about the importance nowadays of slavery, it's very much about past slavery. it's, you know, all the debate about how you can name enslaved people rather than slave or things like that. It's all about past slavery. It's not about people experiencing slavery nowadays.
I've had your book on my desk for many years. I've read it exactly the wrong way. Namely, I've only looked at the papers on my field, which is ancient history, and didn't read the rest. I'm sure you answer my question in your book, but you get the feeling of several historiographies in different areas which converge. And then there is like a déclic. At one point, so we have to write a book in which we compare them. Is this an illusion, or was there really a déclic? And if there is such a convergence, is it endogenous to the historical profession, or is it in fact something that has to do with the political conjoncture?
I would say that we had the déclic. I'm not sure that everybody had the déclic yet. And it's for instance, the book has been read by some colleagues working on American slavery, and it's hard to convince them that they need to do the kind of work we have done. You know, even it's risky and difficult and it's time-consuming, but you are learning something, and they just want to read about American slavery, and they still think of American slavery the way they do it. And so you need to convince them to do it. You know, we are talking a lot about global history, but not so many people are willing to do it, in fact. So.
Continuation to that, we talk about American historiography being pretty self-centered. Was that the case with French historiography until fairly recently as well, or European or other types of historiography?
It's, of course not, but it's related. It's the present situation. It's the hegemony of US historiography on every part of the world, in the sense that you have the biggest academia, you know, and there are more people working here on any part of the world than anywhere else. And that's the only country where you have people working on, you know, all over the world in numbers. And especially on American slavery, the number of historians or sociologists, so it's huge. So even only demographically, of course, there's we are so few that we can't in France. There are so few people doing. Studying slavery that we can't relate only on what we are doing. And so we are forced to discuss with, and it's a good thing, in fact. And, yeah, so, but it was not the case before the 60s. And of course, at that, it was, Europe was more dominant at the time, intellectually, in universities and things, and then things changed over after the end of l'École des Annales.
Thank you so much. I think the structure of the book is very interesting in the way that you respond to these immense challenges of doing comparative history and global history by using more than one model. You know, there's a kind of micro and macro zooming in and zooming out in the different parts of the book. And along those methodological lines, I'm wondering about the place of, and maybe this builds a little bit on John's question, of articulations, because there are the work of comparison is one element, but there are ways in which different contexts of slavery are articulated together, right? And sometimes the African historiography gets disconnected from the Atlantic historiography, or there's a cutoff point that these end up being different histories, and there are these kind of in-between spaces like the Indian Ocean. So I'm wondering how you as a team dealt with those kinds of articulations methodologically. Vaste question peut-être.
First, the answer is in the collective, in the fact that we were several of us, working on several specialists of several places, and where we were able to help each other, to assist each other in connecting these historiographies and so yeah. I'm not sure.
Thank you. Is this working? Thank you very much. I think I'm going to ask the opposite question than the one of my colleague about more individually as opposed to collectively. Actually, one of the questions that I'm most interested in is one of your article about the article where you speak about the Americas, right? Like not the transversal one, but the more kind of situational one. And I'm interested in, I suppose, and maybe that's a wrong premise, but I thought, as someone who's not working on the Atlantic world, that there was this, in the historiography of the Atlantic world, there was this very strong connection between slavery and colonization. And many connections in the plural, and that they became almost coterminous, right? Like colonization is in that part of the world founded on slavery, and slavery is just something that feeds colonization. So I was wondering, as an historian of the Atlantic world, how you now articulate the connection between colonization and slavery after this kind of detour, right? Of looking at other places where the articulation is much less strong. How do that, right? How do you think about it?
So that's something that's a very important question in my own work. And I wrote this article in the third section about slave empires and the relationship between slavery and imperialism and colonialism. And but it's also big. Atlantic history has evolved over time. It's 20, 30 years old now, and it's merging with the global history of empires, and so it's changing very much, in fact. And I'm certainly not the only one promoting this notion of slave empires. And so what I'm trying to advocate is the need both to think about slavery, colonialism, and imperialism, and I distinguish colonialism and imperialism, and separately, and to see how they are then they are connected, especially in the Atlantic world, and with different impacts on Europe, Africa, and the Americas, and to understand the slave trade and slavery, in the sense that you can't understand the Atlantic system of slavery without colonial empires, but at the same time, these empires were very much defined by the slave trade and slavery. And you can't understand the abolition of slavery without the colonial empires. And so it's very much part of the story. And so it's a story of disentangling and untangling these three phenomena and to understand each of them separately and all together. So that's a challenge, but it's very interesting.
Thank you so much for the talk. I had a question about the collaborative nature of the project, and especially sort of thinking about, say, Orlando Patterson's work as a comparative study that he did by himself. And I was sort of wondering that, given the value of this kind of comparative approach, is it then also, in your view, perhaps more important for scholars in the humanities or social science to do more collaborative projects, or how do you weigh that?
Alors, that's the only way to practice global history, in fact. But in the project, I must confess that in fact we, Paulin, Benedetta, and I, and Claude, we were working together, but not so much the others, the 68, in the sense that so Paulin, Benedetta, Claude, and I, we spent 1 year designing the book and thinking about the table of contents, which authors we were going to ask on what topics and so on. And then we asked them to write this article of the first part and second part. And we were discussing with them, but separately. They never met all together. Unfortunately, it would have been wonderful. So they were not part of this comparative approach and this global reflection. You know, each of them wrote their piece and that's it. And that's a regret I have, because the experience of the book for them was completely different than the one we had. But then it was the collaborative work we had with Benedetta and Paulin was just incredible. But you have to find people as committed as you, with the same kind of, as demanding as you, and as willing to do crazy things. And it was very much because of Paulin, in fact. So it's, but the collaborate, so with my other book, the history of the social history of the New World, we did the same. It was a team of colleagues and friends with whom I worked for years and years and years, and it's the only way to do this kind of things, because it's just impossible. Orlando Patterson, he published the book in 1982, but since then, the historiography on global slavery has exploded. So now it's just impossible to read everything, but at the same time we have tools he did not have. And we could work from home with our computers during the pandemic, and it was possible to access all this material, and what he could not have done at the time.
Thank you for this talk, and I wish I could read the book, but I don't read French. I'm wondering about, I noticed that one of the sections was on penal slavery, and I'm wondering how you all define that, and given sort of the activism here in the US around abolition, as we're calling it, how you all sort of documented that in a global context.
So it's the article is about the fact that one of the way you could be enslaved was through justice. Slavery was in itself a kind of punishment, and so the article is about that more than yes. And it's, and it's important because in most slave societies, slaves were brought from the outside, while in the system where justice played a greater role to enslave people, that was an internal way of producing a slave. And so it's a different kind of slavery, more exceptional. So it was, it's in that sense, but not in the, but their works, we allude to what you mentioned, but it's not at the center of the article.
Thank you. What you just said about the different techniques that we have now for doing historical work made me wonder to what extent you used techniques like text mining to gather. Not at all.
No.
Because I think digital humanities
no,
is a huge...
of course, but yes.
Yeah.
But so the second part was based on secondary material, not primary sources. So we did not have to use this kind of techniques for that. So.
Could you tell us more about the cover? Do we know the name of this this person?
Yes, and I can even show you the. No. So the photograph was Alberto Henschel. He was a German-Brazilian photograph working in Brazil in the 19th century. But the photographies are not the originals. They have been colored by an artist named Marina Amaral. And so you have a different impression because they are colored. But among all these photographs, Bennett and I, we wanted this woman on and the editor didn't want the woman. The woman next to the man. And you know, I tried to convince her, but for her, I think that, for me, it's terrible, but the fact that the man seemed naked and his look and everything, I think that in the eyes of the editor, it was saying something they wanted to say on the cover. You know, I'm not. So we had this discussion about the cover. It was difficult, but we thought that it was better to have someone. And then there was the issue when you work about the world. And we had this discussion also afterwards with Leonora Miano. She told us that on social networks, people were commenting the covers, and they say, oh, they have picked an African, or and so on. But at the same time, she told them if they would not have done it, they would have picked as white people, or it would have been worse, in fact. So there was no good choice. But it's the photo. In fact, this photograph was documenting enslaved and free people of color in Brazil with a kind of dignity. It was not degrading photographies, and so it's the reason why we picked this one. But you can find the photographies online very easily, and they are very interesting. In fact, they are not so well known, curiously.
Encourage you read the book if there is someone who wants to translate it.
Please.
Come here. And thank you so much, Cécile.
Thank you.